The Ottoman Empire is one of the greatest empires in the history of mankind.
Why did the Ottomans fall? But it's never like, why did they exist for so long? They've signed these wartime agreements, each one contradict the other.
That's almost like the bedrock of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Probably going to annoy a lot of people. In the Middle East today, they are what I would call inorganic. And what they said they were going to do is just carve up the Middle East almost purely for their own interests. America has been so sloppy with how they've handled the Middle East. There was so much fertile ground and they just gave it away.
Hi Tariq, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
The Middle East has shaped all of our lives, whether through global conflict, oil, culture, and today it's shaped through 20 different countries. But at one point, 100 years ago, it was mainly ruled by one empire, the Ottomans. For those who don't know about it, can you give us a brief description on what the Ottoman Empire was?
So the Ottoman Empire is one of the greatest empires in the history of mankind because number one, they lasted for such a long period of time. They were established around the year 1299 and then they collapsed obviously in the 1920s. So we're looking at a solid 600 years there. Originally, from an ethnic point of view, they are Turkic, but one of the things that made them so amazing and gave them such longevity is that they were able to incorporate the other cultures that they were ruling into their own culture. So today, if you look at Turkey, the country of Turkey, which was a successor state to the Ottoman Empire, it's a lot different to the Central Asian Turkic countries, who are that's where the Ottomans came from in the first place, right? It's because they took on a lot of like Greek aspects to their culture and just other minorities that were floating around in their empire. They were a Muslim state. Somewhere in the middle of their reign, they also proclaimed themselves caliphs as well. So having some sort of spiritual authority over over Muslims as a whole, not just their own citizens. But it started declining very seriously towards the beginning of the 19th century. They were finding themselves being outcompeted essentially in every way by European modernizing, industrializing nation states.
And when people think of empire, the first thing that comes to your mind is the British in India or the French in Algeria. And these are quite like bloody, authoritarian empire regimes that subjugate indigenous populations. Was the Ottoman Empire a more tolerant empire?
So to an extent, that's a great question, but to an extent, it has to be like that, right? Because it's a conquering spirit that they have. It's the same spirit that possessed the British to go across the Atlantic Ocean, through South Africa, into the Indian Ocean, and take over India as well. It's that conquering spirit. So they had it to some extent. We don't need to whitewash history for political reasons or anything like that. But in comparison, if we're talking about tolerance, in comparison to the European colonial states, they were a lot more tolerant, and they were a lot more open-minded.
I think the Millet system, if you can give us a brief
Millet system, yeah.
the Millet system, a brief description on what that was. I think for a lot of the modern day viewers, they wouldn't even understand if a nation could have something like this, where groups are governed by
That's a
different
great
rules.
point. That's a great example of it. A millet system is essentially just allowing the different peoples, using the category of religion, to allow them to be able to rule themselves, make their own laws, have their own courts, have their own judges. That was obviously on an everyday domestic level. Those citizens were not free to commit treason or secede or anything like that. So they did obviously appreciate the authority of the Sultan or Khalif, whatever you want to call him. But essentially they were able to just have their own laws.
So just to summarize, you could have in Damascus a Jewish person, a Christian person, and a Muslim person in the same village, shopping at the same stores, but under different codes and rules, each to their own religion, basically.
Yes, yes.
So on the question of identity, so if we look at one of the largest non-Turkic groups in the Ottoman Empire, it was the Arabs. Now, did these Arabs actually see themselves as part of a broader Ottoman identity, or would they identify more with their city, with their tribe, with their local area?
So that's another very good question. Because it changes. That's why it's a good question. In the beginning, the thing you guys have to remember with identity, everybody has to remember, is what we think of as an identity today. not on an individual level necessarily, but like your relationship pertaining to the state, that's changed drastically in the modern period. Yeah. So to be honest with you, prior to the modern period, a lot of people living in the Ottoman Empire may not have even thought about that question. They may have just seen themselves as being from a specific village, a specific region.
What about the role of religion? Would they have thought we're part of this Muslim ummah?
Yes, that would be there for sure. But remember, a lot of that is impacted by centralization. Do you see what I'm saying? Like centralization of authority, like your ability to be able to impose your will and authority from the capital all the way to the most rural areas. And one of the great advantages of modernity is that in modernity you have phones, you have the internet, you have roads, you have cars, you have a postal system that obviously they had a postal system in the Ottoman period, but it's not the same as now.
As much as we can view these things as liberating technologies,
Mhm.
they're also a way of the state to enforce power of themselves onto us. So with like tech, and you can look at like drones and like CCTV footage. And these are great things. Like CCTV footage can keep you safe, but it's also a way of the state to like, push their control on you.
Absolutely. Not only is it also that, maybe this sounds quite cynical, but I'm pretty sure like at its inception, that was how it was rationalized. Do you see what I'm saying? The advantages to ordinary people was a secondary, beautiful side effect.
So let's look at the 1850s and you're an Arab person in Damascus or Beirut. What would be your first kind of identity? Would it be, oh, I'm a Damascene, I'm from Beirut? Would it be religion? Or would you view yourself as this kind of like larger empire? No, I'm a subject of the Ottoman Empire.
No. So, okay, so one thing that's interesting is the more urban the setting, the more likely the third one, that I am part of a larger Ottoman state.
So an Arab living in Istanbul, Constantinople would be like, oh, I'm part of this Ottoman Empire. But somebody who's living in a Bedouin tribe is much more likely to ally with their tribe than this kind of Ottoman Empire, which, although they're under it, they're not exactly dealing with it day to day.
There you go. Excellent. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself.
So what started to happen sort of with the Tanzimat in the late 1800s where they tried to create this Ottoman identity? Like how did the Arabs react to that? Did they like it or did they try and push back?
So that's when the shift takes place from, let's call it, pre-modern notions of identity to modern notions of identity. Just a little bit of context about the Tanzimat. The Ottomans did it because they felt like they had to do it.
So what was the Tanzimat? Just a brief explanation.
Tanzimat were liberal, so not modern day usage of the term liberal, but like the classic liberal, in the classic liberal sense, liberal reforms that were intended to modernize the Ottoman Empire in order to compete with the Europeans and to stay relevant and to live.
So what did these reforms entail?
They entailed a lot of things. They entailed changes to the government. Constitutionalism became quite a popular subject in the 19th century in the Muslim world. Just 20 years after, well, it's around the Tanzimat period in 1876, I believe, a constitution was introduced into the Ottoman Empire, whereby the powers of the Sultan were to be limited and give a lot more power than before to a parliament. But then that was quickly just gotten rid of after like 2-3 years by Sultan Abdul Hamid II. But yeah, it was to do with statecraft, like how the government was formed, how it was structured. It was to do with notions of identity. The millet system was gotten rid of, and now you were to have an Ottoman identity. Like your primary indicator of identity was Ottoman. It was not Greek, Serbian, Arab, any of that stuff. It wasn't even necessarily Islam or Christian. It's I am an Ottoman subject. So the legal system was changed to obviously get rid of the millet system and just have one homogenizing system. And that word is really important. I want you guys to bear that in mind, homogenizing, because that is one of the most important themes and drives of modernization. I was just going to finish by saying a lot of people think tolerance is a modern concept, but you can make a very good argument that there was more tolerance before, or more of an open mind, I would say, maybe before the modern period, in some senses, because people could be ruled by one ruler, and this was the case in the Islamic world and in Europe as well. But you could have 5 or 6 big languages. You see what I'm saying? And obviously, those things are connected to technological advancements. One of the reasons that homogenization took place earlier in Europe, I think, is the printing press. The printing press started becoming really usable from the 16th century onwards, whereas the Ottomans completely negated that and just looked at it as like, what is this? And they only started taking it seriously like 19th century.
So how were the Arabs actually reacting to this modernization? Because on one hand, you have the attempt to impose the Ottoman identity, but on the other hand, you have the Nahda movement that's also starting at the same time. So how were
Very
Arabs
nice.
actually reacting?
So that's one fascinating thing that takes place is like side effects of intended actions, right? The Nahda took place. The Nahda is directly connected to all of these reforms happening, but the rulers in Constantinople would probably not have enjoyed, or if before the Nahda took place, put it this way, if you had told them that this was going to happen, the sultans would have not liked that to happen. Because I was just going to say, with the Nahda, you get a big chunk of your population that is empowered through printing press, through greater literacy rates, and then they are able to start thinking for themselves. And when they start thinking for themselves, they start realizing, we're Arabs. We are different. Like being Arab is a thing and it's different from other things. So it's a very logical journey to go from there to thinking, maybe we should have our own state.
And looking at the Tanzimat from a broader point of view, the Ottoman, obviously in the 18th, 19th century, was kind of losing out to Europe. And this was a pressure that they were like, if we can modernize, we can keep this state alive for longer. And spoiler alert, that didn't work out. So what were the main reasons for the Ottomans' demise? You've got World War One, you've got it being the sick man of Europe for
No.
close
You
to
can't say
300,
World War
400
One
years.
because that's too late. You know what I mean? That's
But just
too.
in terms of all these factors, what would you say are like the main reasons for the Ottoman falling?
Okay, I'm going to give you historical reasons, but I'm going to give you like psychological, philosophical reasons
Go
too.
for it.
I'm going to start with the psychological because I find that more interesting. This is a very typical thing that happens to loads of big, important empires. They just get lazy. They get complacent. Ibn Khaldun, the 14th century sociologist, spoke about this at length. And the Ottomans actually studied Ibn Khaldun. We know that. And maybe that can explain why the Ottomans have a greater longevity than other imperial states. But Ibn Khaldun essentially said, okay, you have the first generation that are born in tough environments, a desert, mountainous area, etc. And because they're born in a tough environment, they have to have a tough mentality, right? And they're most likely going to be martial people because you don't have land to do agriculture. You're most likely not going to have great educational institutions. So how are you going to make money? You're going to raid places. You're going to become mercenaries. You're going to do it through the power of the sword, so to speak. So then that first generation is very successful. They go capture a big urban center and they establish some sort of a state, an empire, etc. And then the second empire, the second generation, the second wave, let's say, is probably the most optimum because they were born and raised in the tough terrain, but then the city had a civilizing effect on them. You know, they had more access to more knowledge, more resources, different foods, different peoples they can interact with, and their mentality is some sort of a hybrid between the tough primal terrain that they were born in and this new metropolis that they can take advantage of, knowledge-wise, money-wise, etc. Then the next wave is a bad wave. The next wave is where the person that's born in the city is born into luxury, into opulence, and they don't internalize the lessons from their forefathers about what brought them to the dance, so to speak. Like, what was their success based on? Their success was based on a rugged, assertive, aggressive, domineering mentality. I'm going to go out and I'm going to conquer. They just like the nicer things in life.
How much does hindsight play in this analysis? Because when you're in the period, let's say you're in the Ottomans, they ruled for hundreds of years and then they had their peak. So it wasn't like 1, 2, 3 generations. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, that's when they had their peak. And then obviously you had a demise. But when you look at other empires, it isn't that cut and dry where you could say these were the first couple of generations, this was the middle of like the epoch, and then it fell. You had kind of like, it was inconsistent where you had, and then you could look at the Ottomans as well and see periods of like mini expansion where they seemed more solidified, and then like destruction. So how much of this is looking back and giving like a hindsight point of view rather than at the time looking at factors and thinking this could actually lead to my demise?
Very nice. Very nice. I agree with you, but you kind of got it the opposite way around. It's much easier to analyze this with other Islamic states that, say, for example, were only around for like 100, 140 years, like the Samanids and the Safarids and these kind of people. But with the Ottomans, it's a lot more difficult. Everyone thinks the Ottomans started declining after Suleiman the Magnificent. No, they didn't. Definitely not. At the very earliest that I would put that is probably like in the 1660s.
And what led to that? What were the reasons?
Well, second half of the 17th century. What led to that is literally what I just said. But I do want to answer your question about the hindsight in a second. What led to it is literally what I said. These rulers, they stopped going out on campaign and just being much more interested in the palace life. In the palace life, you are just surrounded by the most magnificent opulence that you can see. You will never go hungry. You will never want. And that's a really big problem, especially for men. If you never want, what is going to be the source of your ambition? You know, if you have experienced periods in your life when you are lacking, you know, you want to buy something like a car, but you just don't have the money for it. That, I know it feels really uncomfortable in the moment, but that is really, really powerful. Like what it's gonna do to your mentality, to your mind. You're gonna have a goal, and then you're gonna have an actionable plan to be able to get there. But if you wake up every morning and literally the most magnificent opulence you could even imagine, where would the desire to grow come from?
But why did this shift happen? Like, why did they stop going out on campaigns? Because Mehmed II was born into opulence. He was living a good life in Edirne. Suleiman, again, he was also living in opulence. So what was that shift in the Ottoman Empire where people, or the sultans at least, went from going out in the campaigns, being rugged, to living in the palace life?
And I just want to add to that, let's look at other empires at the same time. Britain never rested on their laurels. Britain took America, the 13 colonies, lost it. They had loads of wealth in London, but still went to India. Then they went to like Africa. Same with the French. So why did this affect like the Ottomans particularly, and what who can we put a name on it?
No, I wouldn't say.
Like, I think giving a psychological analysis is
Right.
like great, but you can't put facts towards it. It's kind of like a narrative.
Okay,
What I'm
okay,
saying
okay.
is like when you look at the Ottomans and you look at them being labeled the sick man of Europe, you can point to technological innovations.
Yeah,
the
yeah.
West were superseding them. The Europeans kind of ganged up on them as well at periods and were like slicing them up. You had Balkan nationalism that was taking away some of their most profitable areas in Europe, and then you had like Arab nationalism coming. So which one of these would you say, if you can, and I know you can never do this, but which would you say was the most important like factor?
Very nice. Thank you for correcting me, because I feel like I'm going too much into the psychological aspect of it, and it becomes.
I think the issue with psychological is you can never prove it because it's all like within the mind. While with factors like, yeah, we can see, I don't know, it's just easy to prove.
I see what you're
when
saying.
you lose the European
Material
states,
factors,
yeah,
and yeah, the
are much
material
more easy.
factors.
I definitely see what you're saying, and when you bring material factors into it, that's evidence, and evidence is amazing. But the psychological is very important because you can see it being reaffirmed in your daily life. You know, that thing that I literally just said right now about when you grow up in want, on a daily basis, I will interact with human beings and I will look at them. Oh, that guy is really, really rich. Let me see, what was his childhood like? Oh, he had want for things, you know? And obviously, it's not going to be 100%, right? Human beings don't work like that. We have too much diversity. But there is a pattern that emerges. But enough of that. Let's talk about the history. It's all of those things that you said, but one really interesting thing that happened, and I don't know how to say this exactly, but to some extent, it was almost inevitable, because one really important development that happened, and it's tough to kind of judge whether this was a bad thing or it was a good thing, because it had really good effects, but it had bad effects too. The bad effect being the sultans were different from the original 10 sultans who were going out, conquering, and imposing their will on things, which was the Ottoman administration just proliferated. It became a lot more specified, it became a lot more bigger, and so as a result of that, more of the sultan's authority would be delegated to bureaucrats, to administrators. And that is one thing that helps to explain the longevity of the Ottoman Empire. But when the decline happens, that is one thing that helps to explain their decline too. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I've got this pet theory that I want to run by
on.
you, right? So I think there's a bit of Orientalism when we come to talking about the Ottomans, because it's always like, why did the Ottomans fall? But it's never like, why did they exist for so long? Because the Ottomans were birthed out of these gunpowder empires. You look at the Mughal empires, you look at the Mamluks, and they far exceeded them. And we never talk about kind of its strength in lasting as long as it did until like the modern age. But we're comparing it with the British, the French, which just seemed a lot more flexible, a lot more kind of technologically superior because they were more modern day interpretations of empire.
I totally agree with you. And that's not fair. It's not fair because you won't be able to get the most important lessons out of the Ottomans. Right at the beginning, when you asked me about them, I told you they are top 3, if you want to be really, really harsh, top 5 most incredible imperial states of all time. Up there with the Romans and probably the Achaemenids. And if you just look at them through the purview of them declining at the same time as the Europeans, the West, were on the ascendancy, you're not going to realize, you're not going to
give it its props because you're comparing it
props
to newer tools. It's like comparing, I don't know, the Nokia switch phone to like the iPhone. For its time, the Nokia switch phone was doing revolutionary things, but comparing it to the iPhone. And then that brings me to my second question. And I know a lot of historians or people don't like doing this, but it's alternative history. So the final nail in the coffin was the Ottomans allying with Germany in World War I because they lost the war and the Ottomans were out. But if you read the history, the Ottomans were quite skittish on joining Germany. And there's an alternative history in which they actually ally with Britain and Russia and they survive World War I. Now, let's say they joined the Triple Entente. It was Ottomans joining Britain, Russia, and France, and they survived. Do you think the Ottomans would have prospered in the modern age? Or, as you said before, was Ottoman decline and it being severed up inevitable?
That's a great question. I would say, I'm not 100% sure about this, but let's say more than 50% I would give to them doing fairly okay in today. Because one thing about the Ottomans that they were really good at, and I'm just going to contradict everything I just said for the last 20 minutes casually, is they were really good at like learning, essentially. You know what I mean? Like in the beginning, they started out as some sort of like quite a tribal Turkic entity, right? And within basically 100 years, they took advantage of all the things that a metropolis had to offer them. So they took Edirne in 1361, 60 odd years after they were established. And Edirne was a big city, really, really important city. So they were able to take from the people around them and learn from them and incorporate that into their identity. But continuing on from what we were saying before, at some point they just got really content with what they had, and that spread some sort of a decay in their overall system where it goes literally all the way from the Sultan ending up being somebody who is just born and raised in a palace, sometimes spending years in imprisonment in a palace. And it goes all the way down to like local judges who are being way more corrupt in the 19th century than they were at earlier periods of the Ottoman Empire. So some sort of a decay happened on an institutional, infrastructural level, right? Why that happened, I think that complacency thing, it's quite... it makes a lot of sense to me, but I know it's not the only thing. But yeah, I kind of forgot.
So it's kind of looking at alternative history. So let's say they sided with the Triple Entente and they survived the war. You can look at factors like nationalism.
Yeah.
There was no way you were going to put the lid on that cup once nationalism has awoken. And they've already lost the European states by that point. If the Arabs decide to go it alone, then you're kind of just left with like what we have right now, like the Turkish central state. So what you
I
said
think it would have
earlier,
been difficult to
yeah,
avoid nation states.
yeah, I think it was inevitable it was going to
Yeah,
fall.
yeah.
It being carved up by European imperialists was like a bad thing and it was horrible what happened.
Mhm.
But the Ottoman Empire was never going to survive the modern day nation state.
No, but it did have the potential to look a little bit different. Not a lot. I agree with
More
you.
autonomy for the Arabs, hopefully, and more like actual
No,
self-determination.
no, no. I think that it would be inevitable for the Arabs to secede. I think it would be inevitable. I don't know if you would have as many Arab countries as you do right now.
In that secession, rather than having these kind of carved up countries that we have now today, like Iraq or like Syria, due to due to European interests. Because right now, the way the Arab world looks, it's Europeans sitting on a map and carving up. You'd probably have something that's like more akin to self-determination. Themselves are deciding what the borders are, and like, okay, cool, the Kurds are here. This is where the Arabs are. Something that reflects more the nationalities there.
Yes, yes, but I wouldn't get too romantic with that way of thinking because yes, you're right. But still, you have to take into consideration that the Ottomans wouldn't have just willfully given out independence to these countries. So those Arabs are still going to have to fight and struggle against an imperial state or the Ottoman imperial state. So that would have a determining effect on what the outcome of those kind of independent struggles would be, if that makes sense. But the thing I was trying to say earlier is that it did have the potential to look a little bit different. Like for example, like the northern part of Iraq has a lot of Turkmens in there. And even when Ataturk was establishing the Republic of Turkey, he actually compromised not by giving up Mosul, which is a major city in northern Iraq. A bunch of northern Syria, Aleppo, that was a little bit of a compromise. Not a lot, but a little bit of a compromise. Aleppo could easily have been part of that, the Ottoman state, modern Ottoman state, and then a couple of other areas. But yeah, on the whole, it would have been revolved around Anatolia.
Do you think in this alternative timeline where, let's say, it's Arabs determining it as opposed to the Europeans, maybe we would have like an Arab superstate led by the Sharif Hussein, or do you think it would be more
Ibn
split along,
Saud.
or Ibn Saud, yeah, or would it maybe be more along sort of ethno-religious lines, and you have a Druze state and an Alawi state and a Maronite state? No,
No, not the second, not the second. It wouldn't necessarily be one superstate, but I think there would be a lot less countries in the Middle East.
So moving on, there's three main agreements which divided up the Ottoman Empire and kind of confirmed its fall. You've got the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, the famous Sykes-Picot, and the Balfour Declaration. Can you give us a summary of what the promises were in each agreement and how they contradicted?
Okay. Wait, what was the third one? So let me just do them one by one. The McMahon-Hussein correspondence was just a correspondence between the viceroy or the British governor of Egypt and Sharif Hussein, who is like some sort of a spiritual authority that has authority in the Hijaz area specifically, where you have the cities of Mecca and Medina that are super holy to Muslims. And the British essentially promised Sharif Hussein, who was seen as some sort of an Arab leader, that once the war is over, if you help us fight against the Ottomans, once the war is over, we're going to give you a really big Arab, essentially superstate that was going to go all the way. Syria, Palestine was going to be a part of it, Jordan, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, yet the entire Arabian Peninsula, Iraq. I think Iraq was a part of it too, but I'm not 100% sure about Iraq. So that was that. Then the Balfour Declaration is the British again reaching out to a prominent Zionist leader saying, if you help us get America involved in the war, we will promise you a Jewish homeland in the future in Palestine.
Where
right?
they've already promised it to this Arab superstate.
And that's where the problem lies, is that you make promises that are going to inevitably conflict in the future. And that's almost like the bedrock of the Arab-Israeli conflict.
And then there's the Sykes-Picot, which again contradicted all of that.
Sykes-Picot, that was the third one, I forgot. So that's, again, the British. This time with the French, just getting together and saying, I know we're going to win the war. So once we win the war, what are we going to do about the Middle East? And what they said they were going to do is just carve up the Middle East almost purely for their own interests. So you have three separate correspondences and they all negate each other. So there's no wonder that the region has so many problems.
Yeah, because they've signed these wartime agreements, three of them, and each one contradicts the other. Like with Sykes-Picot, with Balfour, with the Hussein-McMahon correspondence. I think out of all of them, the only one to come true is probably the Balfour Declaration. Because with Sykes-Picot, you had these zones for like Russia, and then you had the carve-up of Turkey, which never came out. So out of all of them, would you agree that like Balfour Declaration was the only one that actually manifested itself? The others were disregarded.
Yeah, I don't really think there's any space for opinion about that, if I'm being honest. I don't want to sound obnoxious, but yeah, right?
Agreed. And then moving on, let's look at Turkey.
Sorry. Sykes-Picot, they kind of did do it, but with the mandate period, but we no longer have that. I just wanted to put that, yeah. Hey guys, Tariq from Hikma History here. I'm really enjoying my experience at the Whitelist podcast. I want you guys to check them out. They're just starting their journey at the moment, but I can clearly tell they're going to go very, very far as long as they're consistent. Remember that? But I want to thank them for having me on as a guest, and it's been a great experience.
So then let's talk about Turkey. Turkey was also going to be carved up like the other Arab states, but one person wasn't having it. So Ataturk became a national icon when he kind of disregarded what the Treaty of Sevres, what the Treaty of Sevres said, and he went and he fought Greece, fought Italy, formed this kind of Turkish nation state. Do you mind explaining how that happened and why they didn't just literally send an army and tell him to go back into his pen?
Tell who to go back into his pen?
Ataturk, because like if you just won the war, you would just no, but they finally agreed with like, okay, you can take this from Greece, take this from Italy.
Like the Brits didn't get involved, it was just the Italians and
Because
if I've just won the war, I'm not letting whoever I've subjugated to a treaty disregard it and just build their own like nation state. I'm like, you're gonna stick with what we've agreed to.
But Akil, respectfully, that's because you did not fight the biggest war humanity has seen for the last 4 years. You see what I'm saying? So after World War...
There was no will to fight beyond...
Yeah. I mean, if the British had to, they would, but you've just fought, like I just said, the biggest conflict in human history for the last 4 years. Just think about what kind of an effect that's going to have on your treasury, on your economy. Think about what kind of effect that's going to have on morale. Like, do people, your citizens, do they want to continue fighting? And then on top of that, the other aspect is Ataturk. And we have to be careful to not give undue props to Ataturk, because he had a bunch of competent people with him. Ismail Onunu, his number 2 guy, represented him at the Treaty of Lausanne and all of these kind of places, and was quite a prominent military commander as well. So he had competent people, and he was quite competent himself, that from a diplomatic point of view, I'm sure that the British... Obviously, they would have wanted what they initially wanted, carving out Turkey, but I don't think they were super angry with having Ataturk as a reality.
And you can see that will also play out in continental Europe, the amount of like things that Hitler did, and there was just no will to like fight another major war.
Till right.
Yeah,
of
course.
Yeah, no, definitely. So looking a bit more at Ataturk, so once he's, secured the Treaty of Lausanne, he secured Turkey's territorial integrity. One of the first things that he does in 1924 is to abolish the Caliphate. Now, why did he actually make this decision?
So, Ataturk, it's all connected to his overall vision for Turkey. His overall vision for Turkey was modernist, westernized. He wanted his nation state to be modernized and to be westernized. He wanted it to be modernized in a westernized way, right? And the Khilafah, the Caliphate, obviously doesn't fall under that vision. And he wanted to make sure, because he knew it was a new state, he wanted to do things fresh as well. He wanted a break from the past. Interestingly enough, his state is nowhere near as much of a break from the past as people think. But that's a separate conversation. But yeah, essentially it didn't fall under his vision.
Why didn't any of the other Arab states that were emerging pick up the mantle of Khilafah and claim themselves as leader of the Islamic world?
Yeah, like Sharif Hussein or someone like that. So
Hussein was busy fighting Ibn Saud and losing.
Or Ibn Saud, why didn't he claim, like, just taking the mantle also brings with it like great like power as well. You have this kind of informal power over all the Muslims. The 19th century and the 18th century, Britain was so scared of jihad, because they were like, the Khalif can call on millions of Muslims to rebel. So there's great power with this. Why didn't any of them seize on that opportunity? Were there so much responsibility that it didn't seem worth it?
So obviously, like with everything in history, there's multiple reasons, but one of them, the one I want to talk about first, you touched upon it, the British. Remember, guys, when we're talking about these historical events, these people that we're talking about, they are politicians, and politics is a separate art. It's a separate subject. In politics, you can't just do whatever you want. It doesn't work that way. You have a goal, you have an identity, and what you want to achieve, but then you have to take into account like different factors. How much money do I have? Do I have belligerent neighbors? Do I have strong belligerent neighbors, etc.? And the Europeans would not have allowed it. Why would they? It wouldn't make any sense for them.
But what if somebody just professed, for example, again, Ibn Saud was like...
No, but Ibn Saud specifically, in that example, he had a really good relationship with the British.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah. So they helped him out with like weapons and things like that.
What about Pakistan? I don't know. I'm just thinking now, again, Pakistan, they don't seem to... They don't seem as agents of the British.
Pakistan's quite a strange country, if I may say, because it's obviously built
Remember who you're speaking to, I'm joking.
Don't worry. I feel part Pakistani too. I lived there. But Pakistan's a really strange country because it's obviously intended as a homeland in the Indian subcontinent for the Muslims, but its founder was a secularist.
There is contention around that. If you go to Pakistan, people will be upset at you saying that, but I think that's accepted by most historians.
Whiskey drinking, pork eating,
Come on. What are we doing?
The narrative is before his death, he changed and became a devout Muslim.
Yeah.
And he was trying to build this.
That's probably part of nation building, though, isn't it? In terms of like
potentially, and also I don't want to be too cynical, especially when it comes to issues of religion. I like to be quite tolerant, but the decisions you made were in a period of your life when irreligiosity was how you handled it, right? So if you became a super devout Muslim on your deathbed, that doesn't have an effect on the decisions you already took. You see what I'm saying? And Pakistan is a successor state to a European empire, and it has internalized a lot of Europeanness into the fabric of its DNA, which is not wholly a bad thing, right? Because they took advantage of really good educational institutions and learning things to do with administration and how to like govern a country and the bureaucracy of it and all of those things too. No, but they didn't really have to start from scratch either. In some ways, they did in a lot of ways, but they did almost all of them inherited some sort of like colonial infrastructure there.
I just want to stick on the Khilafah because I just read a lot about this where Ataturk gives it up and they sort of shop it around and are trying to get somebody to pick up the mantle. Can you tell us a bit more about that process?
All I know is that in the 1920s and I think the early 1930s, there was 3, I believe, major conferences for discussing the issue. Like, how do we restart the Khilafah? Where do we do it? Who becomes the Khalif, etc. All of these kind of things. But it just never materialized because for a couple of reasons. The main one being it's too ambitious. It's too ambitious. You have really powerful powerful countries that don't want it, European states. At the same time, where you come from has a whole bunch of problems, like economic, just material problems. You are also inheriting colonial states, like from a border point of view. So now you're starting to live with people. I mean, you would have always lived with them, but because of the changing discourse around identity, it made things strange. So a lot of these nation states, I'm probably going to annoy a lot of people, in the Middle East today, they are what I would call inorganic. That's the nicest way I want to say
Let's stick on that. So when Britain came in, Britain and France, and they carved up these new states, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, how much of these represented the indigenous interests of the people living there? Or was this just completely a whitewash of the imperial interests? Like, look at the story of Mosul, where they completely just took it because Iraq was under the control of British. You said before that would have been under Turkish control. So whose interests did the carving up of these states that exist today?
The answer to that question is so simple that it doesn't even... it's not even worth asking that question.
Sometimes I say it because I like to hear from you as well.
Okay,
so
fair
go
enough.
Ahead.
No.
Remember, you're Hikma History and we're just lowly podcasters.
Yeah, no, but it's almost zero. Why would you? If you're a European,
Because of Wilson's 14 points and self-determination, this was, ringing
but
true.
remember, not all white people are the same, right?
Yeah.
So Wilson is very different. Wilsonian democracy, America, is very different from the European. America was created as a rejection of Europe in many ways, right? So even in the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, America was not a fan of European imperial activity. And that's actually one of the reasons why a lot of Muslim states, prominent intellectuals, etc., not a lot, but some, had a bit of a soft spot for America. And Wilson's 14 points is tied into their self-determination, because it's quite a nice way of thinking in comparison to these French and these British that come over, steal all the resources, and whilst they're stealing your resources, they're telling you, you are not as good as me. And in order to be as good as me, you have to become me. So imagine hearing something as beautiful as self-determination when you are used to this, right? Somebody basically attacking every fabric of your identity whilst they're literally stealing from you. America was a very, very enticing prospect for a lot of Muslims.
On this topic of self-determination, so we should be careful not to sort of overly romanticize things as well, because you have so many different ethnic groups, so many different religious groups, and we've seen in places like Lebanon where if they're all together in a state, things can get very, very messy at times. So how do you think Arab self-determination would have played out if that was actually allowed?
The thing you got to remember, and I don't know if you guys remember, but because I caught myself out like 5 minutes ago, those people have lived with each other forever, right? And obviously there would have been like problems here and there, cheeky pogrom here, cheeky pogrom there, or like
Damascus, there was a massacre of
but
Christian
honestly, that
Muslims.
doesn't even that's not even a fair one, because that's still the modern period. That's like 1860, 1861, right? I'm talking pre-modern.
I think humans are always going to have conflict. I think the big thing is state-sanctioned violence, which is what we're trying to avoid here.
Yeah, state-sanctioned violence, and also just the way that your country, your state is structured, right? So the thing that really messed it up, because even though these people had been living with each other forever, and it's a myth to think that people have been at war with each other in the Middle East for thousands of years. That's not true. It's you can't know Middle Eastern history without taking into account how tolerant it is.
On that sort of thing of pluralism and sort of all these different people living together, maybe that's true for the urban environments where you had loads of different people, but weren't most people rural at the time? And if you're an Alawite, probably your whole life, if you're in a village, all you see is other Alawites, all you interact with is other Alawites. Likewise for a Sunni, for a Shia, for a Maronite. Is that not a fair representation of history? Or
not completely, not completely. Because to be fair, and you used a very good example, the Alawites, some groups are a lot more isolationist than other groups. So the Alawites, for example, Yazidis in northern Iraq, they would be a lot more isolationist. But with the other groups, what it tended to be is you wouldn't necessarily have mixed villages, right? You would have some, of course, but you would have like chunks of a place for one group, but then right next to it, like connected to it, would be a different group of people. So you would have constant communication with them, interaction with them. It wouldn't be exactly like a city. To be fair, in a city, it would often be divided into quarters as well, right? So a city is like a microcosm of what I was just saying in the rural areas. So not all of the groups were that isolated from each other.
there was interaction, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Looking at these new nation states that were formed, why did Britain and France opt for monarchies rather than liberal democracies? You have Britain and France, two bastions of democracy. Why didn't they give that to the Arab world? Why was it, no, we're going to put a monarch here, even though he's not from the place, we're going to put a monarch here? What was the reason behind that?
Well, number one, the most obvious one is control, right? If you have a monarchy that you promoted to a monarchy, it's much easier to control them. That person, that family is much more likely to feel some degree of gratitude to you and always know who its masters are, so to speak. And then, what was the other reason I was going to say? Liberal democracy is just really hard to control. It's a similar type point. It's all about control. But liberal democracy is really tough to control because there's more voices, right? The whole thing with democracy is just giving a voice to people. If you have a monarchy where it's just like one king or a family, it's less voices, so much easier to control.
And how did the Arab people view this monarchy that was literally imposed upon them? Because the way Britain were doing it, especially where King Faisal was deposed from Syria, place him into Iraq, and they were just picking up people from different regions. Like, I think the Hashemite family comes from the Hijaz, and they were being placed as the ruler of Iraq, which is like thousands of miles away. Were the Arab people supporting this? Was this an idea that was fine to them? Or did they themselves have like local rulers that could challenge that hegemony that was imposed upon them?
It's a little bit nuanced. It's tough to answer it one way or the other completely, because the Hashemite family, it is quite a prestigious line, right? So quite a prestigious line. They fought for Arab nationalism in World War One. Obviously, there would have been a lot of Arabs that would have still wanted a Khilafah to be in place and whatnot, but there was a lot of Arabs that took pride in them. Not all of them, of course. A lot of them would have felt that they were not represented by that monarchy for whatever reasons, sectarian reasons, ethnic reasons. But a good amount, I'm talking about Iraq, I'm talking about Jordan as well, would have felt some degree of pride towards them. And in the second part of your question about was there local leaders to challenge them, it depends. In Iraq, the Kurds always had prominent leaders, and they expressed that through revolts and insurrections and stuff like that. In Syria, there was almost always quite prominent leaders. Lebanon too. Jordan, little bit, not really. And that is also determined by how close those places were to like major urban centers. Because in the major urban centers, you would have a printing press and literacy rates would be a lot higher. And because of the printing press, people would just know more things about what's happening in the world through daily newspapers. So that kind of intellectual activity would create and mold intellectual leaders as well. So yeah, kind of depends a little.
So while Europe were carving up, you could say, the northern Middle East, you had Ibn Saud kind of taking by storm the Arab Peninsula and unifying it under the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and then eventually taking over the Hijaz and kind of ruling that all. What did the Europeans make of him? They were kind of meddling in all Middle Eastern affairs, but kind of left him alone.
No. They did not leave him alone. They left him alone in the sense that they did not attack him or anything outward like that, but they were in constant correspondence with him because it's not like they were just going to ignore him. Britain had interests in the Arabian Peninsula. Britain had a lot. You got Aden, the port of Aden in Yemen. You have Bahrain. You have Kuwait, really important. They were worried about that. They were even worried about Jordan, Gulf of Aqaba, all of those kind of areas. So they were in constant correspondence. But Ibn Saud had a good relationship, like I said. He constantly reassured them, this is the remit of my ambition. This is what I want to get. Don't worry about Kuwait. Kuwait was quite a big one, actually. Don't worry about Kuwait. Don't worry about those Oman, all of those kind of places. And
what were the discussions like when he was going to take over the Hijaz? Because you've got two British agents. You've got the Hashemite monarchy, Britain's buddies, and you've got Ibn Saud, who's a British agent as well, and he's going to attack. Two British agents are going to fight. What was Britain's role in that situation?
Almost non-existent.
They were just like, survival of the fittest.
Yeah. Because you got to remember, another thing with politics is you have to pick and choose your battles, right? So Ibn Saud, it's kind of strange because the Kuwaiti royal family treated him really nicely for a couple of years when his father lost the second Saudi state. But Ibn Saud wanted Kuwait, like a fair amount. Not really wanted it.
Did he also want the other Gulf states like Qatar, Abu Dhabi?
No, a little bit, yeah. But I'm trying to give you some sort of like a hierarchy of want, so to speak. So like out of 10, Kuwait would be like a 5, 6, 7. But Hijaz was like non-negotiable. That was a 10. So obviously then from the British point of view, it's all about compromise, right? Relationships. The British are thinking, okay, this guy really wants the Hijaz. He's not backing down. How important is the Hijaz? Okay, we've got to think about Aden, right, in Yemen. You're not going to go past Hijaz, right? You're not going to go cross the Red Sea and go into Egypt, all of that. Okay. And we keep Aqaba. Okay. You can have the Hijaz.
Was Ibn Saud's like strong desire for the Hijaz because of the Ikhwan movement and the alliance with Ali Sheikh, or was it just internal? Kind of?
Nice.
Yeah.
That's a part of it for sure. That's a part. So the Ikhwan was a it was like a religious military group that essentially explains how Ibn Saud was able to conquer and create the third Saudi state. Um, they were the one doing the conquering, essentially. He turned on them after when he didn't need them. But yes, in the actual conquest, they were essential. So it was that because, like I said, they were a religious military group. It was really important for them, Mecca, Medina. But also just the Hijaz has always been, it was a part of the second Saudi state. Tell a lie. It was not a part of the second Saudi state. It was a part of the first Saudi state, but it wasn't part of the second Saudi state. And just even from Ibn Saud, let's not make Ibn Saud sound like a complete cynical Muslim who was not interested in Islam. He would have wanted Mecca and Medina too.
Guys, I hope you're enjoying our conversation with Hikma History. If you like what you're seeing and want to see more discussions like this, please like, subscribe, and share with all your friends and family. Thank you so much for your support, and let's get back to it. So, bringing this forward a little bit now, if we look at sort of 1948, after everything that's happened in Israel-Palestine, Israel declares its independence and suddenly gets attacked by all of these other Arab countries who lose very, very decisively. Why did that happen? Like, how was this small fledgling state able to so decisively wipe out all of these other armies that basically were around it?
I've wondered that question a lot in my life, so I had to research it. It's a combination, well, it's almost always this is the answer when it comes down to conflict. One side did something really good, and the other side did something really bad. So let's start with the negatives. The Arabs, what they did really bad essentially was they weren't able to create a cohesive line of communication amongst each other. So the Israelis could just pick them off. They could just focus on the Iraqis, Jordanians, the Egyptians, one by one, right? It wasn't like the Allies in World War II, where the British and the Americans are in cahoots. Oh, we need this bomber plane to bomb Germany. We don't have it. The Americans are like, oh, we got it for you. The Americans are like, oh, we need this specific material for our warships to fight the Japanese. We don't have it. The British are like, oh, we have it.
Was that because of technological reasons, like they didn't have enough communication, or was it more like rivalries and factions?
More of the second. Yeah. Obviously, the first is going to play a role in it for sure, but it was definitely more of the second. Now, so now on the positives, what Israel did good is they were well prepared, believe it or not. So they had militant groups for at least a decade before that had been receiving military training, and they were just mentally kind of preparing themselves for war as well. The Great Arab Revolt happened in 36 to 39. So that was a little bit of a training course, so to speak, with them. And then after World War II finished, there was a couple of militant groups, Stern and Irgun, who wanted the British out. So they started fighting against the British too, and they became, key in the initial inception of the Israeli army. They became like key founding members of it when it was incorporated. So yeah, just that. One side did something really good, the other side was bad.
And then following this defeat, you saw the rise of Pan-Arabism, especially with Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt and this kind of Arab unification. It's kind of funny how they've come together and they've lost to Israel, but that's only reinforced the idea that us Arabs need to be together. Do you mind giving us a brief description on that?
Yes. So Pan-Arabism it became really, really famous, Akil, when you mentioned Gamal Abdel Nasser, 50s and 60s.
And who was Gamal Abdel Nasser? Just a bit.
He was the he was a socialist. I'll talk about that in a sec. He was the president of Egypt, and his ideology was essentially he was a socialist. He was an Arab nationalist. He was also an Egyptian nationalist. People always forget that one. But the thing I wanted to say earlier is that Pan-Arabism was a real thing way before the establishment of Israel as well. Remember, I keep mentioning the printing press and urban centers producing intellectual activity. It was just an outgrowth of that and the Al-Nahda as well. So these kind of ideas had been floating around since the 20s, 30s. No, way before that. What am I talking about? No. Beginning of the 20th century, they became like a real fixture in the Arab political scene.
And what was the goal of Pan-Arabism?
So that's a little bit difficult. So that's the thing with Pan-Arabism is that it's quite broad. So discerning what the goals were is quite difficult. We don't know if they, like some Pan-Arabists, they wanted one superstate, like an actual state that subsumed a bunch of Arab countries, right? But then for a lot of other people, it was more of just like, can't think of a better word than a vibe or like a mentality. It was like we can have our individual countries, but there just needs to be some sort of an outwardly unity between us, right? And it doesn't necessarily, we don't need to get rid of our borders with each other, but we just need to have really, really good relations because you are my Arab brethren, essentially, right? Gamal Abdel Nasser, he expressed the first part of the definition that I said in 58 when Egypt and Syria formed. But that's a really big task to kind of form these countries. Because what ended
Especially
up
when they don't border each other, it seems kind of like impossible.
definitely for sure. Yeah, no, for sure. But that wasn't the main reason that they broke down. The main reason was essentially Egypt just acting like the big brother, right? And the Syrians just thinking, guys,
And then
what
you had
about
it,
us?
and then you had another version of it when Jordan allied with Iraq, and you had this kind of Hashemite bloc as well.
Yeah,
This
that
kind
wasn't for they talked about it and it was going to happen essentially, almost inevitably, but that didn't go through though.
it didn't actually go into
No,
effect.
because in '58 you have the coup in the revolution in Iraq, where the royal family is brutally butchered, including the prime minister Nouri al Said, and then you have Qasim Abdul Karim Qasim, who comes in and he's an Arab nationalist. Iraq first, but an Arab nationalist.
This brings me to my next point. So in the 50s, after Egypt, you see a wave of monarchies deposed for military dictatorships, like the rise of the Ba'athist Party.
Mhm.
Why was that? Why did kind of the Arab people have enough of monarchies and sort of support these kind of like Ba'athist parties that rose?
So, number one, a lot of people saw through the corruption of the monarchy, right? They
Because all
did.
these monarchies were instilled by Western imperial powers.
Yes, that is the outwardly reason used, but more uh, more pertinently, it was that people just did not feel like they were represented by the monarchies, which is kind of scary because it's happening in loads of the world, the UK, the US, etc. There's a disconnect essentially between the leaders and the people for whatever reason. It could be religious, economic, etc., etc. So there was that. Also, that intellectual movement that's taken place in the Middle East was a prominent aspect of it because you get these military officers. Whilst they're training to be military officers, they start becoming ideological essentially, right? So they start picking up books and start reading and start associating with a certain ideology. And then those people in the future, they're going to rise up through the ranks in the military. And then if there's an opportunity for a coup, they're going to be in a position of power.
So how did Saudi Arabia and Jordan avoid this? Because they were monarchies, they didn't have the same uprisings, and to this day, they're still monarchies. So what was different about those two countries?
Nice. Very different reasons for it. Jordan, it's funny. I actually have a video that's done really well called "How Jordan Became So Stable" or
Yeah,
something
we're
like that.
charging you
Yeah.
for this plug, by the way.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, nice. But that I feel like I lied, and I know some people in the comments get at me for my clickbait titles
Because you had
because
like Palestinian uprisings and stuff in Jordan.
they had a bunch of
Yeah,
stuff that they had to deal with. Yeah, the Palestinian
Black
one,
September.
like little state within a state that the PLO created in Jordan was a big problem. But Jordan's history has been quite unstable for the first like say from like 1948 to the 1980s, 1990s. Once they reach some degree of equilibrium with Israel, it becomes and they kick out the PLO at least. It becomes a lot more stable. But how did they do it? I gotta think. It was just nip and tuck, to be honest. You know, like the people did get close. The PLO was really starting to just undermine King Hussein's authority. So King Hussein was a part of it. Um,
What
And it's,
role does demography play in this? Because Jordan isn't a massive population like
yeah, I was
Iraq or
just going
like
to get onto
Egypt.
those kind
Yeah.
of things. It's a much smaller population, a lot more homogeneity with it as well. And yeah, that with Saudi Arabia, it's slightly different because obviously, like the religion plays a lot bigger of a role in the politics of the country, and it's just a different group of people, different setting, and everything. So with them, the state controlled everything, and Wahhabi principles, it was very important for them to kind of instill that in their society. That's not to say that any of these modern ideological trends that were taking place, like socialism, Pan-Arabism, and all of this stuff, was not happening there. You had a Prince Talal. I don't know whose son he was, but I think he was a grandson of Ibn Saud, who was nicknamed the Red Prince because he had socialist sympathies. Um, and so there was a couple of like small little murmurings like that. But also take into account that Saudi Arabia, I know now it looks really modernized and it has like amazing cities and everything, but that's quite a recent development. That started really happening like in the 70s onwards. 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. It's quite in its infancy as a state from a modern perspective. So um, it would have been difficult for those kind of ideological movements to even garner
Gain
any
ground,
attention. Yeah, exactly.
Looking a bit more, you mentioned socialism a lot, and we look at the Ba'athists were socialist, Nasserism was was socialist, and like just in general, there were a lot of socialist sentiments across the Middle East. What was the role sort of the Cold War played within the Middle East, where you had the USSR supplying Nasser, you had America sort of getting involved as well? So how did it play out in that theater?
It was really important. The Cold War, outside of Islamic history, the Cold War is my favorite topic to learn about in history. It affected everybody. You have two superpowers that are competing with each other, knowing that they can't actually go to war. So they express that in a very passive aggressive way by funding and aiding and arming different groups within one specific country or region to do their fighting for them along some sort of vague ideological. For the Soviets, it wasn't vague, but for the Americans, it was a lot more vague ideological grounds. So yeah, like you said, you had Nasser throughout the whole of the 50s and the 60s, could count on the Soviet Union for their support, and he that would have obviously played in his thinking a fair amount, because in that kind of a world, I know you had a non-aligned bloc that was not aligned to either of them, but it's a very scary context, you know, if you are just there naked to the elements without a benevolent, strong friend.
They need to get their weapons from somewhere. So
You need to get
yeah.
your weapons, and also you just don't want to make either of them angry, you know. And it's quite a tribal. In order to understand it, you need to have like a tribal way of thinking. But it's like, if you're not with us, does that mean you're against us? You know what I mean? And so you don't want to incur the wrath of America or the Soviet Union. But it was just a very complex time because, like you said, Ish, the in the Arab world at that time, socialism was quite prominent. So it was a constant fear in these societies that um, the socialists would take power because the socialists of a specific Arab country could always count and always had access, like a backdoor channel access to support from the Soviet Union. So then the Soviet Union, in that regard, could be a force of bad, even for a socialist government, because then now they could impose their will on Egypt or Iraq or any Iran. I know it's not the Arab world. So it was a very complex game of how to balance those kind of interests.
And looking at the Middle East in the 20th century, you started off with Britain and France carving it up, and then you saw the emergence of these new superpowers, Soviet Union, the US, dictating sort of what's going on in the ground. And I think the watershed moment for this is in 1956, where Britain, France, Israel come together to take control of the Suez Canal, and it's the US who step in and are like, this isn't happening. What role did that play in kind of getting power from these old imperial empires to the new kids on the block, the Soviet Union and the US.
Yeah, for sure it did, but the writing was on the wall, basically. The writing was on the wall. NASA wouldn't have beaten France, Britain, and Israel under no circumstances, but I talked earlier about how big of a deal World War One would have been. Amplify that by like 10 in every regard: economics, domestic impact on people, etc., etc. And that's what World War Two was. It's not a surprise that the NHS came after World War Two. British people had sacrificed so much that politicians, they needed to reward them. Like all this sacrifice that we did, what did we do it for? Oh, we're gonna give you a welfare state, right? And that makes it worth it, and it creates like a nice little narrative as well. So the writing was on the wall, but that was a little bit of a watershed moment. The thing that I find so interesting is that America has been so. I'm gonna take off my historian hat and put my geopolitical analyst hat on. America has been so sloppy, and so immature with how they've handled the Middle East, and maybe you can extend it to the Islamic world as a whole, because there was so much fertile ground for them to be
The champions.
the darlings, the beloved of many Muslim societies. And they just gave it away. It's like victory was literally in there at the tip of their fingers, and they said, "No, I don't want this. Move. Give me
defeat from the jaws of victory." So
I can't even wrap my head around it, because even by that point, right? I actually have a video coming out soon. Why the Muslim world hates America. Clickbait. Not every Muslim hates America. Don't worry. But I think the starting point, the first big thing that happened was 53 in Iran. Mohammad Mossadegh, Operation AX.
Mind giving a brief summary of what that was?
Yes. Thank you. Very nice. You're a good presenter. Operation AX is essentially... Okay, before I talk about Operation AX, Iran was ruled by Muhammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the monarchy. And he was quite westernized, and he was seen almost as a puppet of the West. Even if he wasn't a puppet, he was a big fan of the West, essentially. And at the same time as that is happening, the British were essentially in charge of Iran's oil production. Iran has the third most, I believe, oil reserves in the world. So that's not a cute amount of money. You can literally run an economy on that. And obviously there had been like little renegotiations through the years up until 1953, where the Iranians went from owning 0% of it almost to 10, 20, 25, I forget how much it was by that point, percent of it. But the Iranians still felt as if we need more of this. So those two factors, the Shah is perceived to be quite a Western-friendly ruler, with the fact that Iranians are annoyed that their main resource that they have at their disposal is not theirs. You know, it comes from Iranian ground. Why are you taking the bulk of the profit? The British would say it would still be in the ground if it wasn't for us, but the Iranians don't care about that, and I can understand that for sure. So all of this creates a scenario where Mohammad Mossadegh, he's a politician, becomes prime minister, and he, from the get-go, from day one, he says, I want to gain more access to the profits of Iran's oil. The British don't like that, obviously, because they really need oil. The British economy was in tatters after World War II. The Americans helped them out with it, but obviously a little bit of oil money would have only helped. In the end, Mossadegh decides, I'm going to nationalize the oil industry, meaning I'm going to take all of it, right? The British are incensed. They throw a fit. Under no circumstances are they going to accept that. They do a little embargo. They tell all of their friends, don't buy Iranian oil, all of this sort of stuff. But Mossadegh is a stubborn man, and he persists. And at that point, the MI6, that's the external one, I think, MI6 and the CIA, they get together, and they go up to the Shah, and they tell him, listen. Because, by the way, at this point, the relationship between the Shah and Mossadegh was so bad that the Shah had to go out into exile. Only in neighboring Iraq, I think. Or did he go to Rome as well? But whatever. He had to go out into exile. So the MI6 and the CIA, they go up to the Shah and they tell him, do you want your power back? He goes, yes. Okay, so we need you in our little plan. And the plan was called Operation AX, where they just created dissent in Iran at the time because of the oil embargo, and Mossadegh was becoming a little bit more authoritarian, not a dictator, but a little bit more authoritarian. There were already some Iranians that were not fans of him. Initially, they were fans of him, but now they weren't. So there was some fertile ground there. And yeah, it just metamorphosized into a coup. And Mossadegh was thrown into prison. The Shah came back and ruled essentially as a dictator for the next 25 years.
And was that the US's first kind of interest in the Middle East?
Off the top of my mind, no. Definitely not the first one, but it's like the first big event where they determined which direction that specific Middle Eastern society was going to go in. They, especially after World War II, and even during World War II, and before it as well, the Americans, Ibn Saud was a master diplomat. He had great relations with the British, but also the Americans too. So there would have obviously been that correspondence and whatnot, but it was like the first big time that they determined what was going to happen.
And you can't speak about the Middle East without speaking about the Nakba, the Palestinians, and the creation of Israel. What impact did that have on Pan-Arabism and the Middle East generally?
It had quite a big impact. One thing we have to do, before I talk about how big of an impact it was, one thing we have to do is we have to, excuse me for my cynicism when it comes to my political opinions, but you have to remember that individual politicians, it's not like they're exclusively going to be interested in themselves and what's good for them, but that's a big consideration, right, of how people make decisions. So the Palestinian cause has been instrumentalized at various points by various prominent Arab leaders for their own gain, right? Meaning like, obviously they would have had some level of conviction. You can't be 100% cynical and they didn't care about it at all. But Nasser is a good example. So he fought in the 48 war. He was quite early on in his military career. And obviously, I'm pretty sure he would have cared about Palestine, but he would have never ever put Palestine above Egypt. And you can see that in history.
You can see in the 48 war when Jordan have a backdoor agreement with Israel that we're going to take this part of Jerusalem and you can keep the rest, and we'll make sure Egypt don't step beyond what you'll give them. So it's national interest before this Pan-Arabist, like Palestinians are Arab.
For sure.
The way that realpolitik.
Exactly. Realpolitik is an inherent part of politics. If you're not doing realpolitik and you're in politics, you're not doing politics correctly, in my humble opinion. The way I think about it is that the reaction of the effect that the Nakba had on politicians is different from the effect on ordinary people. And even with ordinary people.
What was the effect of the Nakba? Just give us a brief explanation of what the Nakba was and what effect it had on the neighboring Arab countries.
So the Nakba is essentially just the kicking out of 6, 7, 800,000, maybe a little bit more, Palestinians from where they lived, because of the military gains that Israel made during the 48 war. Israel, after 1949, was bigger than what the UN promised it, right? Because they won the war, right? Their war of independence. And the effect that it had on the neighboring countries is refugees. It was a big strain, specifically on places like Lebanon. Jordan is very interesting because I read somewhere that apparently like 50% of Jordan's population is Palestinian from 80 years ago.
The Queen is Palestinian, I think.
Queen is Palestinian, etc. So I think they did a lot better of a job at incorporating them into their society. But whereas in places like Lebanon, the vast majority of the Palestinians in the Nakba that ended up in Lebanon, they just got holed up into refugee camps.
So post-1948, we see the Nakba, where Palestinians have been spread all over the Middle East as refugees. We see this rising Pan-Arabism, Pan-Arab nationalism, and we see a lot of states start to have more belligerent rhetoric towards Israel. So what were the steps that led to the Six-Day War in 1967, where all of these Arab countries actually came together and finally attacked Israel?
You have Pan-Arabism, just Arab nationalism is a thing. That's factor number one. The Palestine issue is another thing. Ordinary Arabs were not happy with what was happening with the Palestinians and how they were suffering at the hands of the Israelis. That's another thing. Then you have individuals like Jamal Abdel Nasser making fiery speeches with belligerent rhetoric.
He had that radio channel that was like the most listened to
Radio Cairo,
in the Arab
exactly.
world.
So there was that. There was also the fact that there weren't any Israel did not have recognition. So after the 1948-1949 war, there was armistices, but there wasn't necessarily peace, if that makes sense. They weren't on peaceful grounds with each other. Israel, I think, is technically still at war with a lot of its neighbors, right? Just by definition. So there was always going to be a possibility of a conflict breaking out, especially because of 56, the Suez Crisis that Keel talked about earlier. That had happened just 11 years before that.
Wait, it makes no bones that it's not an Arab country because it sided with like a foreign imperial power to come and take the Suez Canal.
I don't understand. Say that again.
So Israel could have like had a different transition where it kind of gives out the olive branches like, look, we're also Arab, because a lot of Jews from the Arab world did migrate to Israel. So it could have emphasized that and been like, look, we're Arabs too. Let's work together. But then it's literally sides with with two imperial powers, Britain and France, who have no friends in the region, to take the Suez Canal. And if you're Egypt and you're Jordan, you're like, we can't trust this country. They've just sided. Now we all know Jordan was an agent of the British, but they didn't do anything as explicit as like siding with them in a war against their Arab neighbor.
Yeah, true. But they would have never done that. And you don't need to learn about the Suez Crisis to figure that out. At its inception, that's not what Zionism is.
Yeah, the first war you can say was a war of defense for Israel. They formed their nation state. But the 1958 was just pure aggression on your Arab neighbor.
It was, but even the first war and the...
I'm just giving them the most friendliest interpretation you can.
Yeah, no. I get that.
Yeah.
But I'm saying like... It's the initial war, 48, 49, but it's also what happened before with the UN splitting up the partition of Palestine. It's also things that had taken place before that with the Arab Revolt and the overall Mandate period.
And then we saw the 6-Day War, where again the Arab countries got decimated. Egypt's air force completely wiped out, and Israel were victorious again, and they took the West Bank, they took Gaza, they even took the Sinai Peninsula, Golan Heights. Did that kill off Arab nationalism?
That's a great question. In history, obviously, categorization is very important. And 1967 is like one of the most popular cutoff point for the peak of Arab nationalism. Because, people just realized...
Sadat did a separate deal. Jordan did a separate deal. They all just went their own ways. And
definitely. And even on the Palestinians, it had a massive effect. Because they realized, a lot of them, that we need to take matters into our own hands. And it's not a coincidence that you see the prominence and the flourishment of the PLO post 6-Day War. Because they realized, because up until that point, they were leaving their destiny in the hands of other Arab governments, Egypt, Jordan, Syria. But then they realized, these guys are not that strong. We need to take matters into our own hands.
So once a lot of Arabs realized that Arab nationalism is dead, or it started to die a slow death post 67, does this sort of explain the rise of Islamism in subsequent decades and why people shifted more towards political Islam and radical movements as opposed to secular national Arab?
Yes, for sure. Because you get to see in real time the failure of modernized, secular, Western ideological Arab nationalism, right?
And how is political Islam different to that? What are the main discrepancies?
Night and day. So first of all, just secularism is a bedrock of modern Western political philosophy. Yeah, it is. And in Islam, political Islam, it's the complete opposite of that. The main lens at which you look at life and even governance, forget life, governance is through Islam, right? So that would affect everything, like your law, that would affect finance too, like interest most likely wouldn't really be a thing, and things of that nature.
Thank you so much, Tariq. I think we've done like 50, 60 years of history in an hour. So like, I definitely know we've missed some major parts, but it was just like a friendly discussion. I just want to say thank you for coming on the Whitelist podcast.
Thank you guys for having me. And I wish you guys only good luck. I want you guys to do really well. I'm rooting for you. please keep doing this, because I've checked out a couple of your episodes and I'm going to check them out a lot more frequently after this. But I really want you guys to do well. You got a real nice setup and you guys ask really good questions as well, I might add.
Guys, thank you for tuning in with our discussion with Hikma History, and thank you for the support so far. If you like what you see here, please like, subscribe, comment, and help us on our journey for the Whitelist podcast.